Hi everyone, and welcome to a special series of lectures we're doing on the biomolecules of the SARS coronavirus 2 virus. We usually talk about biomolecules as a part of the course, just at the end, but we haven't tested it in a few years. So again, this isn't going to be on the exam or anything like that. So if that's the only reason you've been watching these, you can stop right here. You don't have to carry on. If you're interested in some of the biomolecules of life, especially the polymers, and what they do for us, then I hope you enjoy what comes next. Um, we're going to break it down into 5 quick videos. This intro one, and then one for each of the major type of macromolecule that we find in pretty much all living organisms, including virus. Um, what I want to convince you with this is that even though we talk about this virus all the time, maybe you haven't thought to really break it down into its component parts. And that kind of analysis is one of the things that chemistry allows us to do, and one of the things that the sciences that are really centered around chemistry lets us do. Um, so even though there are a huge number of specialized molecules that we as human species and in all species rely on for the functions of life, for the structure and the functions of life, this includes something like water, gases like oxygen, or dissolved gases like nitric oxide, any kind of solid minerals like our bones, so that's hydroxyapatite that's listed there, um, or even calcium carbonate for seashells, that sort of thing. They all have important roles. It's fine, but a lot of the heavy lifting is performed by organic molecules. Again, the source of the historic name for it. So even though there's a variety of those too, so we're thinking about steroids, adenosine triphosphate, as well as like thousands of tiny hormones, signal molecules, and very specialized molecules. There's a handful that are extremely important and also quite common. Um, so we're going to talk about those specifically, but just to give you an idea to begin with, like what is a biochemical pathway and how complex do they really get? Like when I say that there are a large number of organic molecules, what is large? So here I've pulled out just one major metabolic pathway for a yeast. So this is just for respiration in a single-celled, simple living thing. These are some of the major components in a simplified biochemical pathway. Maybe it doesn't look that simple on the screen, but believe me, compared to how precise you would have to actually be in order to look at all of these structures, this is extremely precise. So each of those, so glucose obviously is a molecule. Each of these that are smaller molecules in here are actually enzymes, which we'll talk about eventually, but that themselves are complicated organic molecules. So we have glucose going to glucose 6P, so that's a phosphorylated glucose, to fructose, to glyceraldehyde. How are we going to follow this down? Okay, to pyruvate, so this is helping us get into building some energy. And what do we get for waste products? Okay, so we get some ethanol, we might get some acetate. Somewhere around here we're going to find some carbon dioxide. So when we think about yeast, of course these are some of the byproducts that we're looking for either baking or alcohol production. But that's completely beside the point, except to say that the biochemistry gets real complicated real quick. So viruses, even the coronavirus that we're looking at, they're a lot simpler. So we even sometimes kind of guess around to say whether they're alive or just kind of an assemblage of molecules that interacts with life. It's difficult to say. I think most virologists would call them alive, like a species, an organism, even though they don't have a lot of the markers of most things that are alive. From a materials chemist point of view, I don't think I would call it an organism so much as I would call it a liposome or a nanoparticle. So these viruses exist right on the very cusp between what we would normally classify as just a chemistry and material properties and the biology world, where it's going to start interacting with organisms and an ecology. Um, at 100 meters in diameter, 100, 120 meters in diameter, the coronavirus is definitely in the nanoparticulate range. So I don't have any problem calling it that. So if we're looking at across this diameter, maybe only being 100 to maybe 140 nanometers, it's definitely inside of the range that I would be comfortable with as, say, a nanoscientist. Okay. Here is a very nice transmission electron microscopy image, obviously false colored. We don't see any colors at this size. So if this is about 100 nanometers across or 120 nanometers across, so we'd have 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. So this whole thing across, this whole picture that we're looking at, that is about the wavelength of blue light, okay? So that's only just kind of inside of our visual spectrum is the size of, what do we have there, 4 or 5 of these virus across. So this is smaller than a wavelength of light. So not something we can pick up that way. We can, however, see it using electron waves. So we can use an electron microscope to have a good look at them. What we're seeing here is the nuclear envelope on the outside, and then these surface proteins, which we're definitely going to talk about, that are causing us all the problem. So I can say that it's about 100 nanometers. I can say that it's a fraction of the size of light, but we don't really talk about the size of light that often either. So how big are these things? So to put it into some kind of perspective, we want to compare it to, say, an animal cell. So that's something that we actually can see under a microscope. Obviously, you can't see it just with the naked eye. A cell, okay, cell sizes range quite a bit. Our cells are going to be on the order of a few micrometers, so a few thousandth of a millimeter, a few millionths of a meter. One of the ways you can think about it is if a piece of hair, so the diameter of a hair was a foot, an animal cell might be a couple of inches, say 10 centimeters. And compared to that, one of these virus particles would only be about the size of a poppy seed. Another way to think about it is if the virus is the size of a tennis ball, how big is an animal cell compared to this virus tennis ball? Well, an animal cell would be about a third the size of a singles tennis court compared to a single virus tennis ball. Just to get it into some kind of perspective, these are extremely small. How does this look when it's invading, or actually when it's budding out of an infected cell? Well, fortunately, we have some nice photos of that too. So each of these tennis ball looking things on the surface of this dying cell is one of the coronavirus particles budding out and spreading away from there. So each one of these, actually I shouldn't say that because we don't know exactly how many it's going to take in order to infect a cell, but let's say a fraction of this is going to be sufficient to move on to the next set of cells and to infect them as well. Okay, so it doesn't need any molecules to function because it's not really functioning in the way that a yeast or a plant or person has to do all of the functions of life. The virus is going to infect a cell, take over the cell's machinery to do its job for it. But it does contain the 4 major types of macromolecules that we would normally talk about on this course anyways. So the first one that we're going to talk about is lipids. So these are fats and oils, essentially. These are non-polar hydrocarbons and fatty acids, like we mentioned with carboxylic acid and talking about soap. These make up the membrane envelope that are going to contain the virus. So that kind of bag, the water balloon looking thing, that makes up the body of the thing, the virus. Okay, so if it's a saturated fat or a saturated lipid, it would look like lard, like an animal fat. If it's unsaturated, it'll behave like an oil. We'll talk about why. And it's also related to these phospholipid bilayers, which I'm sure you would have heard about, say, in a biology class before, that make up these cellular membranes, including the cellular membrane of the coronavirus. Okay, the second type of macromolecule we'll talk about are proteins. So these, of course, are everywhere in us, major component of muscle, but just about everything else as well. These are copolymers of amino acids, which you'll remember we talked about in class, have an amine group as well as a carboxylic acid group. And these can bond together to make long chains of amino acids that do jobs, that either do functional tasks or provide some structural support for tissues. So we'll talk about the different levels of structure to proteins, and also special proteins like enzymes and how exactly they function. And the coronavirus has about 10 surface proteins that are important for it to identify, to bind with, and to enter cells. These are the product of what its genetic sequence is telling it to do. So when they talk about the virus replicating itself, what it's really doing is pumping out a lot of these particular surface proteins, and then packaging them up into a new virus and shipping them off outside the cell. Okay, so we'll look at exactly how those function. The third major macromolecule that's in pretty much all living things are carbohydrates. So we've talked about carbohydrates before just as any molecule that is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So it's right there in the name, right? Carbon and hydrated carbons. So carbon and water, essentially. These are going to be polymers of sugar molecules used for either energy storage or structure, or also in some cases recognition when they're bonded either to lipids or to proteins. So we'll look at starches, cellulose, glycogen, chitin, other things. So something like cornstarch or just simple sugars we use obviously to store energy. When we eat them, we're going to take the energy out of storage and use it. But it's the same monomers that go into making either the shells of beetles or the cellulose that goes into tree wood. Okay. And the final one, of course, we're going to mention are nucleic acids. So this is the RNA and the DNA, the instructions of life that carry the information that encode proteins and all of the processes that go into cellular functioning. So the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 is an RNA virus. That means that it doesn't have a DNA strand in it. It has an RNA strand, which makes it slightly more susceptible to mutation and also a little bit quicker acting. So we'll talk about the differences between these, what those nucleobases are doing, and how they're bonding up, and actually maybe we'll dig up the whole genome for this virus because it's out there. Okay, so that's a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at in the next 4 videos. I hope you join me for those, and please look them up. And until then, stay safe.